coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. This week, we're going back to school again, this time to talk about the nerve-wracking process of applying to college. Education and the school experience is such a central part of the show, and Rory's decision about where to go to university is a major point of contention throughout Season 3. So this week, we wanted to look at the significant moments in her journey to the Ivy League.
As always, before we get started, this is your warning and fair reminder that this is a spoilers all podcast. If you haven't seen the show in its entirety and you don't want to be spoiled, please click away now and then come back when you've seen everything. And as always, if you could do all of those YouTube things for us, please like this video, subscribe to our channel. It's one click and it really does help us out. That being said, let's dive right into the synopses.
All right. Season 3, Episode 15, Face Off. The Stars Hollow High School Fighting Minutemen hockey team has made it to the regional semifinals, and the Dosey clan makes the pilgrimage back for the game. Rory becomes frustrated when Jess is uncommunicative and flaky about their plans, and in an effort to not sit around waiting for him all weekend, she takes Lorelai's advice to get out of the house and go to the hockey game with Lane, who was there on a date with her Korean beard, Young Chu. While at the game, Rory runs into Lindsay, who she used to go to school with, but when Lindsay is cool toward her, she wonders why, until she sees Dean kissing her between periods. Lorelai tells Jess he's going to have to work a little harder with Rory because she knows how she should be treated, and Jess surprises her with Distiller's tickets, which causes her to forgive him even though she left him a forceful message on their answering machine just minutes before he showed up at the rink.
This is followed up by episode 16, the big one. And the moment of truth has arrived. College acceptances are due to arrive, and Rory and Paris wait on the edge of their seats to find out whether or not they get into Harvard. Chilton is celebrating its bicentennial with a televised ceremony and a speech contest. Rory enters the contest just to have one last opportunity to beat Paris at something, but Headmaster Charleston decides to have Paris and Rory combine their speeches and present them together. When Paris comes over to rehearse, she reveals to Rory that she slept with Jamie, and she's not sure how to feel about it. Paris shows up for their speech late, frazzled, and unkempt, and she reveals to everyone, including those tuning in on C-SPAN, that she had sex but didn't get into Harvard. Rory comforts her, and they mend their friendship. Meanwhile, Max Medina is back in town, and Lorelai runs into him at a pharmacy in Hartford, and then again at Chilton, which makes her question whether she's really over him or not. Alex who?
I love the big one so much. I don't know if this is anyone else's comfort episode, but I absolutely adore this one.
I rewatched it twice this week.
Yeah. And of course, spoiler alerts were already given, but also my t-shirt is a huge spoiler alert.
Yeah.
I got my topical t-shirt. Thanks, Kirk. Yeah. So we've already talked about gifted students and sort of the educational system more broadly and the show's attitudes towards education. Getting a little more specific this week, we're talking about college admissions because it's such a big thing in Season 3, which is, what we're smack dab in the middle of right now. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Season 3 is one of my favorites. We'll talk about this more when we wrap up Season 3 in a few weeks. But I just love so much of this college stuff. Again, total nerd. Loved my college experience. In case you couldn't tell, it's such a nostalgic thing for me to watch any media that has to do with school or university or applications to these things because it's just such a beloved part of my own personal history. So I'm really excited to talk about this stuff because it's fun and we get to live vicariously through people who have different experiences than us. So, and on that note, I'm Canadian. I didn't go through a lot of this stuff. My experience was very different to Rory's, not only because, obviously I didn't apply to any Ivies. That didn't even seem like a realm of possibility thing for me. I knew about the prestige, but I was never really I'm going to Harvard. So, it's not really a thing here unless you're, kind of on that Harvard conveyor belt yourself somehow from your parents or from pop culture influencing you. It's a very different vibe and process here. And, I've done some research for this particular episode and y'all are wildin' down there. It is insanely complicated and hard. And there's so much pressure on students. I don't remember any of that. I knew I was going to go to university, but I did not feel this kind of pressure to pick exactly the right school and to think about my legacy. Like, I just, I liked school. I did well in school. I wanted to continue going to school. There was no familial pressure. My mom wasn't like, you have to go to the school that I went to. Like, there was none of that for me. And so I find it so interesting to look at it with Lorelai and Rory, and Lorelai and her parents, and Rory and the grandparents, in terms of like the attitudes that people hold toward college and where you should go and why you should go and all of that. So let's get into some of this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anywhere you would like to start?
Yeah, let's start with, and this is going to overlap, I think, a little bit on pressures on gifted students, but when do you think the application pressure generally starts for your typical student?
For your typical student, my guess would be what, 10th or 11th grade, especially in the US where the SATs happen in grade 11. So we don't do that here. We don't have we don't have SATs. There's no standardized testing. And if an American tries to apply to a Canadian school, they might look at your SAT scores or whether you've taken AP, but it's really not much of a determining factor. Like, we're very much in looking at your high school transcript more than anything, your overall GPA, your other extracurricular stuff, your volunteering, those kind of things are far more influential on the admissions process in Canada. And another major difference between Canada and the US is that most of our institutions are public. There are private universities who can confer credentials, but like, you're way more likely to go to a public institution. So it's a very different vibe that way. But yeah, like, I remember doing my own personal ones in my senior year of high school. And even then, like, I didn't give it nearly as much thought as most people. But we're not dealing with the average student with the show. We're dealing with the high-flying private school kids. And I think, to Paris's comment, I think it's in Tale of Pose and Fire, actually, when she's like, my parents branded me wrong. I should have been at the 92nd Street Y, We've talked about this before. We're like, she said she was flipping through Harvard catalogs while Rory was still like watching, was it Gumby or something was the reference? And Rory says she's more of a Pee Wee Herman gal. Mm-hmm. Insinuating that children are being put on the conveyor belt, on the treadmill of this college legacy thing, which is disgusting. And even Carol talks about this in Application Anxiety, where she's like, I'm sure every 4-year-old dreams of going to Harvard. It's right after meeting Harry Potter.
Yeah.
So, it's one thing to be a normal high school student and starting to think about this in your like junior year as you're taking your SATs, and you're like, where should I live in 2 years? And thinking ahead so many steps about, where should I go to preschool? Where should I go to grade school? Where should I go to high school? And having, the sort of like the feeder school to the feeder school to the feeder school mentality that seems to run rampant, especially through the wealthier classes who have the money to put their kids in private schools.
That just like, it blows my mind, first off, for so many reasons. I was born in the wrong country. This is just another reason why. But and I was not even in the private school system. I was in a public school system for my entire life, but I still had those pressures put upon me really early on. I remember in 8th grade, so I'm like 13 or 14, you have to take a grade 8 proficiency assessment, which will determine whether or not you can start getting into AP college courses as a freshman and start accruing credentials then. And if you do, then great, you can start accruing college credentials as a freshman. So that way it offsets some of what you have to do in 4 years. But if you don't, then you have to ride the train and just try again, maybe as a junior. But I remember even being in 9th or 10th grade and taking not even SATs, but taking the PSATs, because if your PSAT score is good, that can also factor in. And it's just a good test indicator for then how your SATs are going to be and how your ACTs are going to be. So I was constantly being told by my educators, take all of these tests, whether you do well or not, but do well. Do it and take it. And it was just endless Saturdays of test taking and standardized testing and AP courses that I was put into from 9th grade, because it's like, if you take these AP courses, maybe that's one less thing that you have to do in 4 years as an 18-year-old, but the coursework is still the same. So now you're expecting a 14-year-old to do what an 18-year-old is doing in terms of the legwork, and your brain is not that, it's still processing, it's still, rendering, it's still doing its thing. So yeah, there's so much pressure within the American school system for that. So it tracks with what we see with Rory and Paris, but even more so because they were at Chilton, a private institution that probably did tenfold to them what I even had to experience. It's outrageous.
Wow. I am godsmacked by that. I can't remember if you've ever told me that before. You might have mentioned it in the past, and I'm just blanking on it right now because classic. But 8th grade, that's insane. The fact that we're asking like 13, 14-year-olds to get themselves on a track like that. It's kind of even unfair to ask 18-year-olds to plan the next 4 years of their life and their entire career and where they want to live and all of these things. And so that blows my mind. And yes, you're right. Your country is weird and backwards.
Not arguing.
Yeah. Spinning off of that, why do you think there's so much pressure, not only to sort of get on the conveyor belt, but like to go to a top school specifically? What stands out for you, whether from Gigi or just from the real world, about how we perceive top colleges?
I mean, unfortunately, but it's a reality. I think capitalism plays into a lot of it, with just like, America, we're the best, we're number one, which means that our citizens need to be number one, which means that we need to be excelling within the economy and within production and within law and labor and agriculture and everything. So we need good performance-based results. We need everybody to just excel and be top of the line. And we can't all do that. And it's like, I'm not going to tangentialize, but also like, there are other professions that don't require those sorts of degrees or that sort of continuing education that are just prevalent and vital to any sort of country or society existing and supporting its people. So it's just unnecessary pressure. But I do think capitalism plays a lot into it. I think it's also probably stemming from population density and just how big of a boom there's been, not just within the United States, but within the world over the past 100 years in terms of the population growth. So now we're needing to support more people through those means, which again just means that we need to be the best at everything, because that will allow us to acquire more and then just generate more revenue, be better. Like, there are so many horrible reasons, but I think it's largely stemming probably from those two, and also just from this, that just, again, it's very basic, but just like, America, we're number one. Like, we run the world. Like, who runs the world? America. So
Yeah, Beyonce got it wrong.
yeah. So I just think there's also that really toxic mindset that perhaps we even have as a country, that we need to be the best at everything.
That was a magnificent answer. Well done. Love it. You're right. Also, another spoiler alert. You're not. Like, you're not necessarily the top at everything.
How dare you?
I know you like to think you are, but like, for one of the richest countries in the world, you still have some major problems with poverty and equity and a number of other social issues. So apparently your educational system isn't doing much to correct the actual problems. They're just sort of reinforcing themselves, unfortunately. But I think you're right. Labor economics has a huge, huge impact on this. And yeah, people want their kids to go to a good school so that, like, there's name value. There is value in going to an institution that has name recognition. And like, there's this theory in labor economics called signaling theory, which is sort of like some pushback to the Chicago theory of human capital. And it basically is like, education doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in your human capital, but what it does is it signals to employers that you have the abilities that prospective employers want. And so you're going to get above average wages because of that. Like, they're going to see, like, it doesn't matter what you did or how well you did at that school, just the name will signal to whoever you're working for that you've got the goods, even if you don't. And so that is kind of, it's a part of it. And another part of like sort of the human capital, of which education is a huge component, is the other variables like personal connections, whether it's via your family or whether like it's other people, other insiders from wherever they come from, fraternities, sororities, professional groups, anything like that can sort of like give you that sort of connection that you need to make a move, basically. That's another part of it. And a lot of that comes from where you go as well. Like just all of the associations you can become a part of at institutions like this that can catapult you into the places you want to be because of their connections. So that's a big part of it. So yeah, that's really an interesting observation you have there about capitalism. And yeah, your country is just absolutely steeped in that individualist culture, and that plays into a lot of issues when it comes to sort of school and education and how you're made to feel like your failures are your own and your successes are your own, when it's not necessarily entirely the case. That, it may not be just that you're talented and deserve what you get. And it may not be that you're incapable or undeserving of what you got. There's a lot of luck involved. There's a lot of systemic issues involved. And I think that some of the attitudes we have about universities and admissions and education don't always take some of these larger societal issues into consideration when making decisions.
Yeah, stemming off of that, let's talk about privilege. Not just within the show, but there is a lot of that in real life as well. But I want us to start with Rory's privilege and how that privilege allowed her to not only, we'll get her into Chilton, but how do you think that then kind of snowballed into how she was able to apply to these Ivies, to the rejections or acceptances that she got back? Do you think she would have been as successful if she didn't have that privilege? And that even if going a step further along with that, if she didn't have Emily and Richard?
Rory, rejection? Never.
What?
Like,
that's a thing.
How dare you insinuate? Actually, well, that's the thing. She didn't get any college rejections. Yeah, the Gilmores and privilege is such an interesting conversation because Lorelai likes to pretend like she doesn't have privilege. And so, she feels self-righteous in her rejection of the nepotism and the money and the legacy. She's like, no, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I did all of this by myself. And then the minute she wants something different for her daughter, she runs to her parents to get it. And I don't actually have a problem with that necessarily. It's like, if you have the resources, there's nothing wrong with utilizing those resources, as long as you're not doing it in such a way where it's unethical or it's crowding out other people who are deserving. So like, actually, I was rewatching But I'm a Gilmore, and Mitchum says something. We'll talk about this more too when we talk about journalism. But when he offers her the internship, he's like, life is about taking what's given to you. Now, this is being handed to you. What are you going to do about it? And it comes into play here. They were trying to take advantage of opportunities to get them what they thought was a better life for Rory, which honestly, I find to be a little hypocritical as well, because it's just like, so you want her to have the life you ran away from, but just in a different way? I don't know. I think it's sort of, again, going back to that American dream bootstraps narrative of, the Puritan work ethic and earning everything you get, and it being a reflection of your own personal sacrifice and labor to achieve something like that. Because, Lorelai doesn't seem to have problems with, earning her own money or sending her kid off to an institution that costs tens of thousands of dollars a year, but she wants to do it herself. She's not willing to accept help or take anything for it. until the moment comes when she can't pull together the enrollment fee for Chilton. And so it's just such an interesting hypocritical cognitive dissonance that Lorelai deals with throughout the first couple of seasons, where she wants this lifestyle for Rory, but she's not willing to look at the systemic things that allow them to have it in the first place.
Hypocrisy within the Gilmore and Huntsberger households? How never.
And there was a second part to your question, so I'm going to let you answer it. Like, do you think that this would have happened to her? Like, would she have gotten into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale without Chilton, where she learned, like, that's apparently where she learned that you need more than just good grades to get into a top school? Like, would she have gotten that same information from Stars Hollow High? Would she have had the resources there to get her where she needed to go? I mean, I'm guessing the answer to that question is implicit in the premise of the show, but you can answer it regardless. And would she have been able to do it without her grandparents?
I'm going to start with the most basic and general answer that I can give you. Would Rory have gotten into Harvard or any Ivy without Chilton? And I will say blanketly, like, no, she would never have. And it's not from a lack of smarts, and it's not from a lack of know-how. Like, I feel like she could have graduated Stars Hollow with like a, million point GPA, off the chart extracurriculars, glowing recommendations from teachers. And I feel like she still would have found rejection letters in an influx from any Ivy that she was possibly pursuing. I feel like just the Chilton name got her to even be able to meet with potential members of Ivy League staff, like, who were going to be interviewing her, who were going to be looking through all of these applications and deciding who gets in, who gets out. And obviously, Richard and Emily play a huge part of that, because Richard's just like, do you know how much money we've donated to this school? Like, of course she's going to get in, and, it's because, like, if she doesn't, I'll just call it, like, make a phone call and be like, I've donated 6 figures to this university. How dare you not let my granddaughter come here? So yes, Emily and Richard played a huge part in just, laying out the red carpet for her to get into some of these places. I feel like the Chilton name did it too, because, I just think, like, any admissions advisor or, like, person who is reviewing that is going to say, I have student A who went to Chilton, one of the best private preparatory institutions in the United States. And then I have Joe Schmo from the cornfields of Nebraska, who is also a 4.0 student, but went to Cornstalk High. Just don't take that the wrong way, folks. I'm sure Middle Clump is great. Nebraska, go you. But which student would an Ivy let in? Unfortunately, I think they're going to let in that one who went to that private institution, who probably has better resources and better funding to even pay for that education. And they're going to be dismissive of that other individual because they just they're not the shiny trophy that other student is. And I feel like that's still a very common and prevalent thing that's happening even in 2023 in the United States with college admissions. It hasn't gone anywhere.
I completely agree with that. Obviously, Rory gets into Yale, and that could have been because of her grandparents. If she had gone to Stars Hollow High and she wanted to go to Yale, they probably could have made that happen for her. But the fact that she also got into Harvard and Princeton is what demonstrates to me that it probably was the Chilton name and the prestige that comes along with going to a private institution like that. So completely agree. And we'll probably talk about this more in the future. I don't have this episode scheduled yet, but, just looking at the economics of private versus public, and, you get suburban high schools inflating grades to make their students look better to top colleges. And you get charter schools in rich neighborhoods who are getting kids into top colleges. So technically they're public, but they're still, beneficiaries of wealth and politics and all those kinds of things in terms of school board funding and all those other social issues that feed into that. And yeah, you're completely right about that. So yeah.
I want to talk about someone specifically in the show who goes through the admission process and is not as successful as Rory is. I'm sure you know where I'm leading us. Because I think it's also a just even more truthful reality that a lot of students face. And I want to talk about it because I think it's so, so important. And it's something that I personally even experienced myself. I don't know whether you did too, but I think it definitely merits a conversation and a huge chunk of the time that we're going to spend talking about this. But I want to talk about Paris. That girl cracked and just broke apart at the seams pretty much within the same, like a 24-hour period. And again, I think that is something that happens sadly to so many young people who are going through that same admissions process, who are just banking their futures and potentially their livelihood on getting into a university of choice or a top university of choice. I mean, again, spoilers all podcast, but spoiler alert, like Paris does not get into Harvard. She is rejected and she cracks like an egg because of it. Talk to me about that and how you feel she handled that rejection. How you feel, like, just what do you think of that, how she handled the rejection, but also the pressure, and this goes back to like pressures on gifted students. Words don't fail me now. But just what are we doing to our young people when we hand them these rejection letters and we see them fall apart like this?
Oh, yeah, it's so sad. It's incredible to me that scene is at once so cringy and so funny. Liza Weil knocked that one out of the park, making that kind of a humor scene. That and Richard falling asleep was what made it kind of funny. But the underlying emotion is just heartbreaking because, she says it herself to Rory, like, this is all I've ever wanted. Harvard was my destiny. 5 generations of Gellers have gotten into Harvard. And, even if I was the reject of the family, that name should still carry some weight. And just look at the things she lists off to Rory in Hammers and Veils when they're doing the rebuilding together. She's like, listing out what Rory refers to as, like enough volunteer work to knock Mother Teresa off the list. She's gone above and beyond for most of her life doing volunteer work and leading study groups and doing practice essays and just a litany of things to add to her resume for Harvard. She has devoted her entire life. She's worked her butt off for years and years and years. And she's rejected. She says up on stage in this episode, "Who in the world deserves to go to Harvard more than me?" And the fact that this is the episode in which she gets the small envelope and gets rejected, but Rory gets 3 big envelopes. It insinuates to the audience that Rory deserves it more than Paris, even though Rory is the one who's been running around like a chicken with her head cut off for 2 years, being like, I haven't done enough to get into Harvard. I'm 10 years behind. Like, I'm not even going to repeat what she says she has to do because it uses the R slur and it was just awful. And she recognizes that about herself. She's like, I'm horrible and underqualified. Yes, you are. Like, it just reinforces the narrative, both to the audience and to Rory herself, that she's special somehow and that she deserves this above and beyond people who have a legitimately better work ethic than she does. I'm not saying she has a bad one, but look at what Paris has done to get to this point. And she still gets into great schools, which is fine. And again, that sort of plays into the idea of luck and systemic stuff. But then again, she's a Harvard legacy, not a Yale legacy. So I think it was the pressure she put on herself that made her crack in her interview. And she says it to Rory. She's like, I think I pinpointed the exact moment in my interview. And she plays it back for Rory. And you can hear the hyper intensity in her voice, which is something that the college admissions people from application anxiety warned them against. They want to weed out the hyper intense. She's kind of an example of what Lorelai says to Rory in episode 3 of the season, where she says, when they're talking about the essay topics, and they're talking about like, maybe write about one of your authors that influenced you, and she's like, Sylvia Plath, and then Lorelai says, that might send the wrong message. But at least, she made her kids a snack first. Make a joke out of a woman unaliving herself. Classy. But again, Paris is an example of the wrong message. She is the hyper intense. She is the unstable applicant that is a red flag to an institution who wants to create top leaders. And, they can only do that with people who have the fortitude to make it through their school. And it was a red flag to them, just how intense she was in cutting off her interviewer and in going off the rails topic wise. She was like tangentializing basically about population control in Europe. Like, why is this a topic of conversation in your college interview? So yeah, it was all the pressure she put on herself. I think especially for her Harvard interview, she probably did better in her other interviews because she viewed them as less consequential to her future. And ironically, it didn't serve her well to be so worked up in her Harvard interview. So it's really sad that someone who put so much effort into shooting for her dream school wasn't able to achieve that dream initially, which I think maybe is a commentary in a larger sense about how having tunnel vision on a single institution is probably not a good idea because of things like this. Because at the end of the day, I don't think one school is an end all be all for anyone, no matter how much you think that way or how important you think this is. It may not end up being the best place for you. And if you're just going to be so focused on it, you're going to cut yourself off from other opportunities and researching other places that might actually be a better fit or have a better program. Like Harvard isn't exactly known for its journalism program. Why isn't Rory going to like Northwestern or something where that's a focus, where she's going to work with like the best journalism professors in the biz? I just, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we're so focused on one thing to the detriment of all else. And it's unfortunate that Paris had to learn that lesson the hard way by devoting her life to something that at the end of the day didn't impact her nearly as much as she thought. She was like, what am I going to do? Is Jamie going to want me less? How am I going to tell my parents? Like, are they going to think I'm not special anymore? This is how she derives a lot of her self-worth and validation. And it's so sad that that's her primary sense of self-worth. But we see later how that grit, that tenacity, that work ethic serves her well at Yale, to the point where in her senior year, she's applying to all these other amazing Ivy League institutions and top schools, and she gets into multiple medicine and law programs, and she ends up at Harvard eventually. But this 18-year-old girl cracks under the pressure that she put on herself and that society put on her and that her family put on her to go to this one school that has a measly acceptance rate. It's crazy. And not only that, but then there's the sex politics of it all, where she's like, I can't believe I had sex with Jamie. I'm a slut. Like, she's equating these things in her mind where it's like, I had sex, so now I'm not going to Harvard. Pack your chastity belt, Gilmore. Like, that's a messed up idea. And again, I still can't tell if it's the writers who actually think that way or if it's a commentary on people who think that way.
Just for like, I would hope that it's a comedic entry, because then even when Rory gets her big 3 envelopes, Lorelai's just like, wow, you're the biggest virgin ever. And it's like, they don't go hand in hand. Like,
it's not a causal link.
I will admit that I laugh at it. Like, that whole C-SPAN scene with Paris breaking down, I'm not Rory. I'm not holier than thou. Like, it's meant to be tragic and telling, and unfortunately a truthful reality for so many young people trying to get into a university. But from a writing perspective and a comedy perspective, I watch that scene and I'm just like, I will chuckle at it because it's funny. And then Lorelai's comment of "you're the biggest version ever," I'm just like, not great, but like I still laugh at it. Like it's a little bit of both, and I think that's where kind of the responsibility falls on the viewer to just like take what's being spoon fed to you the right way, and what you said is correct. One doesn't equate to the other. So I think it was just a comedic entry. And I think they juxtaposed it well in the big one with having Paris break down on C-SPAN in front of, on national TV for everyone to see. Richard just falls asleep during it. But I think that juxtaposition is handled well when you then have a follow-up scene of Paris just having a complete breakdown over the future that she envisioned for herself, just being taken from her with one letter, and Rory having to console her through it and try and reassure her that everything is going to be okay, when for Paris it probably seems like the world is ending.
Yeah.
Thankfully Paris rebounded well and went on to Yale and was successful, but that's also not always the case. Like, sometimes you can get a rejection letter, especially when you're so tunnel visioning in on one school and it doesn't pan out for you, and so then you're just like, well, that's it. My future's shot. There's nothing left for me. That's also something that I think unfortunately happens a lot of the time, where students are just like, I didn't get into my school. I'm a failure. So there's my life, folks. Like, thankfully, again, Paris rebounded well and handled it well. And I credit Rory for that, for being a good friend to her and helping her through it as best as she could. And for Paris's own just internal strength that she inevitably drew upon. But again, like, look at what we're doing to these young people when we say you're not good enough for whatever reason, and have a nice life, but it's a no from me.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale against putting all of your eggs in one basket like that and using it as a source of external validation, when what we should really be emphasizing is education as being inspiration and not aspiration. You should want to go to school to study what sets you on fire, what genuinely interests you, or what you want to devote your life to for whatever reason. Ideally, that wouldn't be economic gain, but hello, we live in a post-capitalist hellscape, so that's just kind of the reality. But I think it's more important to actually study things that you're good at and that you love, so that you can take your talents and your interests and make the world better that way. We don't look at schools as being like a place to go better ourselves. We look at them as like status symbols, and it's really sad. And I say that as someone who went to a school that's a bit of a status symbol. So yeah, it's really unfortunate that we're forcing kids that are so young to dump so much of their identity into this, when education can be fabulous. I absolutely adored my post-secondary education, but I think I did because I chose things that were interesting to me. I didn't necessarily just take only courses that were going to get me the kind of degree that was going to make me the most money. I tried to have a balanced experience. I joined a sorority. I played sports. I had fun with my, the people in my dorm. And, I have memories and friends from that time that are irreplaceable. And I think that's more important than being so hyper-focused on performance all the time, because, unless you're going to be some sort of top surgeon or specializing in something that requires you to be the best of the best, I think a lot of us can take a more, relaxed approach to education and just be like, I'm going to go and I'm going to make myself better and I'm going to enjoy myself while I do it, because like these are some of my best years. And what was it? I can't even remember where this came from, but I was watching something recently where it's just like, I finished college and these were the best years of my life, but I forgot to make them the best years of my life.
Mm.
And I think that's so important. You have to enjoy this. You have to take it seriously. You're spending a lot of money on it and it is impactful to your life, but don't let it be the end all be all. You can still go on to do great things, even if you don't have the fanciest of educations or the best grades in your class. So, that's my advice to the youth of today.
The youth.
Yeah, you should listen to me. I am a wise 33-year-old woman now. I've been through it. I'm on the other side, theoretically. But, speaking of tunnel vision, I want to go back to Lorelai and Rory for a little bit and stop pontificating about, the purpose of education on a more philosophical level. Let's go back to their focus on Harvard and the conveyor belt conversations. Where do you think this comes from? Why Harvard? Why not Yale? What is it that pushes Lorelai to emphasize this to a very young Rory and to encourage Rory to stick to this, despite evidence to the contrary that this is maybe the best place for her?
I mean, I'll start with saying why Yale or why Harvard, and I think it was because Richard went to Yale. So honestly, as petty as it is, I think there was absolutely a part of Lorelai that was just like, oh, please, like, I want the world for you and I want you to go to an Ivy because I feel like you are smart enough to do it and you can get yourself there. But not Daddy's, like not Richard's, like just any other one, because it was just too much overlap for Lorelai. And I think that's why even when Rory gets accepted to Yale and she's considering it, Lorelai has a really hard time swallowing that pill and just being like, no, you can't consider Yale. You can't consider Princeton. It has to be Harvard. And I think it was just because she was still just not wanting Emily and Richard to have that satisfaction of her potentially going to that one school. But Lorelai is also very guilty of placing that unnecessary pressure on Rory. And it's tricky because Rory definitely wants that for herself. And so that's good. And it's good for a parent to be encouraging. But Lorelai tunnel visioned, I think, even earlier than Rory ever did. And then Rory just saw mom's tunnel vision, made it her own and absorbed it. And that just led into, well, if I don't get into Harvard, I've not only failed myself, but I've failed my mother. Why do that to your child? There's just so much there that's wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting how Lorelai reacts to the news that Rory didn't just apply to Harvard, and the fact that she's so concerned with her going to Harvard and yet knows nothing about this process somehow. Like, you would think that she would know something about Harvard beyond just like, oh, it's one of the best schools in the country. Like, no, it's like number 2 in the world behind only Oxford. Like, it is up there with the most prestigious institutions in the entire world. How did you not know that? I knew that. Like, Elle Woods knew that.
What, like it's hard?
Yeah, this brings me to one of my favorite quotes. I don't even remember what episode this is from, but at one point Richard's trying to encourage them not to tunnel vision on one school so soon and to consider other options. And he's like, well, who's going to help her get into Harvard? Reese Witherspoon.
Duh.
Oh, so good. But yeah, I think it might have been her maybe teenage rebellion, because there's that anecdote of the time she goes into Richard's office and takes his diploma down off the wall and says, I'm going to go to Yale just like you. And then as she starts to pull away from her family, she's probably like, well, not Yale, but Harvard. Let's do that instead. And you're right. I think it sort of rubbed off on Rory, and she absorbed it to the point where she could no longer differentiate between her mother's beliefs and her own. And I still find it ridiculous that she only applied to Ivies, 3 Ivies, and not more. I don't know if maybe it was a different landscape back then in terms of what the number of institutions to apply to was, or how relatively competitive it was. I think things have changed a lot, and each year it gets more and more difficult as the world becomes more sophisticated and education becomes more sophisticated, and admissions officers start seeing the same things over and over and over again, and then the bar just keeps going up and up and up for how hard it is to meet and exceed those standards. And with increased focus on test prep and exam scores and all of these things, making it just increasingly difficult to get in anywhere. Not to mention the way the pandemic reshaped the landscape of education, and how many spots are available and how much money is available and all of these things, making a massive dent in the college landscape. So wait, how did I get here? Right, the tunnel vision. It was an interesting one, and I'm a little disappointed that Lorelai didn't take more initiative in researching schools, because it was just like, well, we're gonna get into this great school and that's gonna be it. Like, as if Rory is just so special that she's guaranteed to get into a place with like what, a 2% acceptance rate or something. Like that's just a number I pulled out of thin air, so don't quote me on that one, but it's a very small number. Very few people actually get in compared to the number of applicants. And so the absolute hubris involved in being like, Rory is so special that there's absolutely no way that she won't get into this one very prestigious school. And they thought that getting her into Chilton would just handle it. There's nothing beyond this. It's just, this is the step. We're taking the step. It's, yeah. I wish she had taken more initiative and done more research, because there's that scene in Application Anxiety when they go to Friday night dinner, and Emily's like, here's a bunch of issues of college magazines. Have you read these? I'm sure Rory has, as if all of this should fall on Rory. If you're like really trying to do your best by her, why aren't you doing more legwork to like really make sure that you're doing what it's going to take? You're just being very laissez-faire about this.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And jumping off of that, I just want to talk about not only from like yes, Lorelai should have been more well-informed with the application and admissions process in order to better guide her daughter. That's also what guidance counselors and the school systems are there for as well. But I want to kind of lead us into with that idea and that like mindset. You made me think now about, at least in the United States, the requirements that go along with an application to any university to be considered for that school. And I want to start off with one of them in particular, and that's an essay. Do you think that colleges, universities should still be requiring personal essays from applicants? First off, yes or no? And
that
if your answer is yes, well, you know what? Answer my question first, and then I will re-ask, because I know that's a big one. Should the personal essay be a requirement?
Part of me wants to say no, and the other part of me is like, well, it is a decent way to differentiate certain intangible skills that are maybe harder to get from just a hard number grade, like communication skills, expressiveness, creativity, and just personal outlook on the world. It's a very interesting vehicle to accomplish something like that. But by its very nature, that makes it subjective. And subjectivity creeping in too much allows bias to creep in too much. So it's a really interesting one. Fun fact, I don't think I wrote any college essays. You
Really?
don't? Yeah, not every institution in Canada requires them. I applied to 5 schools in Ontario and 1 in British Columbia. So in Ontario, the way it works is there's this thing called the Ontario Universities Application Center. And so you submit everything through that. And like, I think you'll probably have like personal profiles and stuff where like maybe you answer some questions like that, but it's not really the same as like, this is my Common App essay topic or whatever. Like it's, it's stuff about you and what you find important and which programs you want to apply to. And then they put that out to the schools on your behalf through this like provincial-wide portal. And the only school that required like a statement of personal interest or any like formal essay on top of that program or on top of that application process was Queen's University in terms of like the ones I applied to. There might have been other ones, but like I applied to U of T, Guelph, Western Ontario, Queen's, and Ottawa. And I really wanted to go to U Ottawa. And so I went to Queen's in grades 9 and 10 on enrichment programs. And I liked the school, but I was like, I've kind of been there. Let's do something else. And so I wasn't actually interested fully in going to Queen's by the time I hit that place in my application process. And so I just straight up did not finish that application, basically. And I got in everywhere else. I accepted Ottawa very early. I think I accepted in like December of my grade 12 year. And I applied to one school in BC because my boyfriend at the time said he wanted to potentially move out there because at the time you could make good money in construction. And in the end, I got into UBC, I dumped that boyfriend, and I went out there and he never did. So there was that. But so I ended up at UBC, even though I had already made the decision to go to U Ottawa. So it was a whole thing, but I didn't need to do an essay for U Ottawa in the first place, or sorry, for UBC in the first place, though I was just checking to see if their admissions requirements have changed since. And so they require a personal profile. But this is an interesting question because I was recently watching a TED Talk that happened to be hosted at UBC by a UBC student or alum called The Rise of the Trauma Essay. And so this is a really interesting area that I will go into, but you did have a second part to this question. So yeah, fun fact, I didn't actually write any college essays, so this isn't something I know all that much about, but I do have more on it once your question's done.
Yeah. I will say, obviously, I did, and it wasn't even like a personal choice. It was just, again, something where when I was starting my college applications, which I did before grade 12, that was kicking in early again. But it was kind of just a known thing where it's like, you're not going to apply to college without an essay. It goes hand, like you need one. You have to have one. Start writing. And it better be damn good. And so even after you wrote that essay, it was then something that was submitted to your teachers for review, for critique, so that they could make sure that the essay you were submitting with your application was as best as it could be. But case in point, my second question is, if you do think that essays should be required or are good to have in addition to the general application and submission of test scores, what should we be instructing young people to write about in a college essay? What should that topic be? I mean, you're not going to say, should it be politically based? Should it be more personal, talk about a life experience? I mean, if we're going to ask our students to do this and require this essay, what are admissions advisors expecting to read about? And Gilmore Girls touches on this as well. So in terms of, if you're going to write about this, but what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it does feed into my talk about the trauma essay. Asking them to get political could once again cause a lot of bias to creep in, because I think, educational institutions are supposed to be places where our ideas and beliefs are challenged and where we're taught to think critically. And so if you have young people coming in trying to give informed opinions on something that maybe they don't have the full breadth of knowledge that would be required to make an informed opinion, it's maybe asking a little too much of them, and it could put them at a disadvantage if they happen to get an admissions official who holds opposite views and allows that to color their perception of the suitability of a candidate, right? So we don't want that. I would say it would be more important to talk about who you are as a person and why you want to go to that institution specifically. What about that institution or its programs draws you there, location-wise, program-wise? All of these things are important. Like, you need to be dedicated to that place. You want to bring people to your campus that want to be there, not necessarily just people who are applying to you to be like their safety school or whatever, right? So like, it's more important to have them tell you what it is about their campus, their programs, their credentials make them want to go there. And so, and it's also more important to have them reflect on their values and their beliefs and like where they want their education to take them in the future as well. Like it's all kind of well and good to have them tell a little funny anecdote from when they were younger and spin it somehow into a demonstration of their creativity or their perseverance or any number of other positive traits that would make them a good candidate for higher education. But education at the end of the day is about the future. It's about the next generations who are going to be running the world, and we want people who are future oriented and who are community oriented, who are able to look outside of themselves, outside of their little bubble, to be able to make a contribution to the world. And so I think that would be the most important focus. What do you think? Do you agree with me, or do you have like a different or something else that could add or be different, better, similar?
I honestly, I mean, and again, this is probably stemming from how much I hated doing it myself and how, I mean, diminishing I think it can be. I understand when you are having just a large swath and pool of applicants apply to one university, you're going to have to weed them out somehow. Not everybody is going to be able to get in. It's just unrealistic. So you're going to start by looking at grades and standards and what that university has into place. But the essay requirement has to exist so broadly across the United States for a reason. And I have to think it's because what you are writing about is holding water to the admission department, whomever is reading this. And I have to question, like, why? I mean, why does it matter? I am firmly in the camp of like, get rid of the essay requirement for anyone applying to a college or a university, because I feel like there are other ways to potentially distinguish a person's individuality, maybe perhaps even like, meeting with them if possible, if that's what you want to do. Maybe having like, it's 2023, maybe having like a Zoom call or something to then, further get to know this individual, better that way, and talk with them and ask them like directly, like, why do you want to come here, and hear what they have to say, as opposed to asking them to write something down on a piece of paper that just feels so, I don't know, just
Strategic.
cold.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not getting to know the person that way, because you're just, it would be like saying like, oh, Kate, tell me about yourself, but I don't want you to actually talk. Just like write it down and maybe I'll read it later. I'm never going to really get to know you well in that way.
And they're so short too. You've got like 500 to 700 words maybe to get across your personality and your goals and your beliefs and all of this stuff to someone who doesn't know you at all.
Yeah. And going into how it tied in with Gilmore, there's that great scene where they're just like, please don't everybody write about Hillary Clinton. Write about something that's more personal to you. And that also ties into what I think you brought up also, where it's like, trauma essays, is that what we're asking now? Like, dredge up something that was like tough for you in your life and talk about it. And maybe, why is trauma in someone's life getting factored into a university decision? And I will say this briefly, because again, I don't want to tangentialize or make this too personal of a thing. When I ended up writing my college essay, I was advised by my guidance counselor to write about a traumatic event in my life and how it impacted me and how it made me a better person. So I did it because that's what I was advised to do. It was a tough essay to have to write because I was forced to relive something through writing it that I didn't want to have to. And even thinking back to it now as someone in their 30s, I would love to just go back to the admissions folks that perhaps admitted me at the time, and I would love to just be like, so did you admit me because I had good grades, or because you loved my sad story about myself? Like, which one did it for me? And if it's the sad story, that again would just lead me to be like, why does that matter? Why did it matter at the time? So my answer is, get rid of the personal essay. I don't see why that should carry as much weight in an admission decision now as it still does.
You make excellent points. It's hard because obviously numbers don't give a full picture of a person, you know, and you can have people who have nearly identical statistics and metrics, and yet they could be coming from very different states of preparedness or very different circumstances, very different curriculums, different school boards, diverse communities, diverse personal circumstances, right? You need to know a little bit more about these people because you want to make sure that like you're providing the opportunities to people who are going to take them and run with them and are not just going to like drop out on you, right? You want people to succeed. You want people to be a good representative of your institution. You want them to go out into the world and make you look good by extension, right? So there has to be some way to do that. I like your idea about like the Zoom interview and like actually getting to know people. Another fun fact, I didn't do a single school interview. I had never been to UBC. I had never been on an airplane before I went to school in Vancouver. It was not part of the application process. I know, right? It was just like bizarro to like watch media about American school stuff, and I'm like, I don't have to do any of that. What is this? It's like, I mean, it makes sense, but like, whew, wow. But yes, on the topic of the trauma essay, everybody should go watch, I believe her name is Tina Young, if memory serves, her TEDx talk at UBC. It was wonderful. It's just, you know, asking people how they turn their pain into progress or resilience or other positive character traits, like, is one, messed up because it forces people to relive traumatic experiences when most people have not had a chance to process them yet. Sometimes that takes years of therapy to unpack. And sometimes traumatic stuff is just bad. Like, why does every bad thing that happens to us have to be turned into a learning opportunity or a way to develop better time management? Like, it just reinforces toxic positivity narratives, you know? It's just like it takes something bad that happens to you and turns it into something you can use as a way to market yourself, to look better to, again, people who have never met you and have never had to see what you went through. It's just, it's a simplification of the reality that sometimes we can't just get over these things. Like, we can't just overcome systemic racism or poverty or, you know, disease, bad personal circumstances. It's not always necessarily possible. It doesn't mean that we're not going to succeed in our academic endeavors if we haven't worked through that yet. But it's a bad way to assess who's deserving or not, you know? It's really gross how we do that. Like, and that's the thing. They're not explicitly asking kids to trauma dump in their essays. But this style of question of like, tell us how you turned a traumatic event into an opportunity, it works. These are the like sob stories that get people into school, presumably. Like, I don't know if there's any direct data on that because I feel like there's an opacity to this process where admissions officers don't maybe give out those secrets or tell you exactly what it was about your application that stood out or was the determining factor. But yeah, just the fact that someone encouraged you to do that, but some other admissions counselors might counsel you against doing that because that kind of essay now has saturated the college admissions landscape so much, like it's become a thing. Again, plays into the narrative of the individualistic American dream bootstraps narrative. I overcame this bad thing and I'm still a good person because of it. I turned my trauma into triumph. Like, I actually like wrote down an entire quote from this video that I think nails this point home as well. Your story has to be just sad enough to gain empathy, but not so sad that it makes you seem beyond help. Just critical enough to inspire change, but not so much that it actually criticizes systemic structures. just honest enough to seem real, but not so unfiltered that it creates discomfort. It's another instance of having to sacrifice authenticity for marketability, which facilitates a kind of break between who we are and who the world wants us to be.
Thank you and good night.
Yeah, like brilliant. This whole thing was wonderful, but I'm also confused over here because I'm like, you had to write an essay to get into UBC? I think it's something that they sort of brought in maybe after I went. Either that or I just straight up do not remember this because it was 16 years ago, dating myself a little bit. I do that too much these days where I tell you exactly how old I am. But yeah, this was like 2007, and I just straight up don't remember exactly how I got into all these schools. But yeah, it goes back to what I was saying about Sylvia Plath sending the wrong message, and like, because you don't want to use any trauma that's going to make you sound unstable. And again, it just sort of forces you to pick something where it's like, it's something that's just bad enough that you'll get some sympathy out of it, but not so bad that it makes you look like you have major mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And like, you're going to be a liability to them, I guess. Mm-hmm. But this is something I find that Gilmore Girls doesn't really delve into very much, because we don't actually end up finding out what Rory wrote her essay on in the first place, and we don't know what Paris wrote about. It was kind of just, like, for lack of a better term, like privilege porn a little bit, where it's like, we're turning this into a competition between two pretty privileged white girls, rich white girls at that, like upper middle class or better. And like, it's a commentary about class and legacy instead of any real concrete information about their applications to begin with. And granted, that's fine. They didn't have to, turn the lunch with Darren Springsteen into an actual advisory panel. You know what I mean? But they just sort of gloss over the details, and they don't actually tell us how Rory got into Harvard. They just made it seem like this magical fairy tale that she got in, and glosses over the realities that a lot of students have to deal with these days in just how strategic they have to be, and how they have to take like something that's like just bad enough, but not so bad that they have to like re-traumatize themselves or make themselves look bad. It's got to hit exactly the right note. And it's a lot of pressure, and it's a lot of subjectivity that goes into this. It's a fascinating concept and a whole other discussion we could have, but anything else on that before we move on to a different topic?
No, I think we covered all of the bases with that. I stand by what I said. I would love to see the essay requirement just be totally rid of. Don't judge people that way. If you want to get to know them, it's 2023. Again, like I would be an active proponent of universities, wanting an admissions person or even someone on the staff, like as a professor, to even maybe conduct like a 10-minute Q&A with an applicant. That seems to me like, why not do that? Find out like, and talk to them why they want to go there. Don't ask them to like write something down on a piece of paper. We're not living in the Stone Age anymore. So I think we just need to do better in that regard.
Yeah, I like that idea because, as I said, like when you give out just sort of a generic prompt, you're going to get a variety of interesting answers, but you're also not going to find out specifically why they want to go there. Again, it's the game and the name recognition and the putting your application out to as many schools as you can afford to apply to. It's crazy how it happens. But then again, do they have time to talk for 10 minutes to tens of thousands of applicants?
Well, no, but
is that like realistic?
That's what I'm saying. Like, take that, like, let's say just on, like, I'm going to use the 10,000 number. You have 10,000 applicants to your university. You deem that 7,500 of them have the credentials to get in based on their initial application. You admit them. Maybe you have room for 500 more out of the remaining 2,500 applicants. Maybe then take the time to see if you have the resources to reach out to some of those 500 that, you consider like really strong potential maybes and go that route. Like, there would have to be like a systematic something put into place to see if that's even realistic or feasible, but go that route instead. And like, don't just say like her story was sadder and she overcame more and she's getting in, and you're dismissing somebody who could have probably really maybe just been successful at your university and would have brought a lot to your campus and to your the school environment. I don't know. I just think like there's still a lot of antiquated things that are put into place within the admissions programs that just need serious revision, considering, again, it is 2023, folks. Let's revisit some of these things.
Yeah, good points. I think that, there has to be a mechanism by which schools can differentiate students who maybe don't look as good on paper, but still deserve the opportunity to explain themselves, So, yeah, it's a possibility. We're not here to reform the education system overnight, but things to think about. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to something I said a minute ago about how the show is kind of more of a commentary on class and legacy. And let's talk about the Springsteen lunch. Again, played for comedy. It's funny because they go to the Springsteen house and Rory hands him a packet of like, these are my records. This is my credentials, right? This is what I got going on. And he's like, well, I'll look at this later and we'll just chat. It's like, it's almost hand wavy. I mean, granted, he makes a good point. Like they only have so much time physically together. They should get to know each other. But it's almost more like that stuff doesn't matter. The fact that you're here and I have connections to Harvard, that's the part that matters. And then they waste no time in being introduced to both Darren's highbrow interests, like his modern art collection, and his lowbrow interests, like sports, but with more of a focus on the highbrow stuff of like, oh yeah, we know that these people have money and can afford stupid metal sculpture and Zoltan Kameni's Zoltan. Yeah, so we get just sort of an immediate, both visual and explicative notice of their wealth and their class and their station in life. And then we go to the lunch portion of things where they play that like trivia game around the table, and it focuses on, how many random facts they can memorize and like who can out memorize the other person. And Lorelai just kind of sits there and doesn't know how to answer any of these questions. And so she's sort of painted as lesser than in this interaction. Mm-hmm. And it's played off as, she's not as intelligent because she didn't go to these fancy schools, even though, again, she put herself through school and has a business degree, right? Like as if Lorelai is a dum-dum. And then that topic comes up again later when they're at Yale, and she goes off about the like, oh, here we go again, like your daughter's a loser, but Gilmore name sullied, that whole speech that she gives after Rory goes in for the interview, and Lorelai is kind of rightly mad at her parents especially Richard, for not telling them about his plan. I mean, they could have deduced it for themselves given the situation, and they kind of did. I'm mad at Richard for not letting Rory be more prepared for that interview, but that's, I think that's a pretty common like thing that people notice and critique it on. So I don't want to dwell on that. I want to kind of look at maybe what the rest of the interactions between Rory and Lorelai around this whole Springsteen lunch says about the process and about their relations to each other. And yeah, do you have any takeaways from that lunch scene?
Yeah, again, it was never going to be about Rory's credentials. I mean, that's why this man puts the file aside so quickly, and he's like, no, it doesn't matter. Like, he was just looking to be impressed by Rory as a person, which is not wrong necessarily. But at the end of the day, he was going to just be actively judging her and then allow his own personal judgment to dictate whether he called in a favor and said, oh yeah, you should maybe bump this girl up on the list, like consider her more, or say like, nah, she's weird, I didn't like her. You can probably just put her file at the, bottom of the pile or just dismiss it altogether. Who are you as one person to be passing that judgment, and for that judgment to potentially have such a huge impact on, in this case, Rory, but a person's entire future? How is that ever okay? You know, you didn't know this girl before today. You're only going to be spending a couple of hours with her, and then it's going to be whatever it is that you say coming out of your mouth dictating potentially the next 4 years in her entire life for her. That's so wrong to me, because you don't have time to you could be passing a judgment that's just wrong. That's incorrect. Like, maybe Rory, let's say hypothetically, was just like the world's biggest asshole, but you thought the sun shone out of her, you know where. So you're just like, yeah, admit her. And, you know, so when Ivy's just like, yeah, okay, great, we will. And, you know, she never deserved it, or vice versa. You know, you have an applicant or a person who's just a wonderful human being who would have so much to present to a university, but you don't like their personality, or it clashes with yours, or for whatever reason. So you're just like, I don't like you know, consider somebody else. Like, that's someone's life. How can you do that in the span of an afternoon? So no, I hate all of that too.
Yeah, good point. Again, with the subjectivity and the connections and all that kind of stuff. One of my big takeaways is that there was that moment where Darren asks, like, what's your alma mater? As if post-secondary education is the default. And, you know, Lorelai has to say, well, I was a little busy weighing 500 pounds and having feet twice my normal size. You know, so she obviously resorts to that kind of humor, self-deprecation there. And Rory's the one who has to step in and be like, but she has an AA degree in business. You know, she graduated last year. And Darren's like, that's good. That actually might be to Rory's benefit. You know, good things didn't come to your family in one fell swoop. You worked for it. No, not true. I think there was still, again, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of inherent privilege that was at play in Rory's application and acceptance process. And two, again, goes to the topic of almost a bit of like a trauma essay, where it's like, we overcame adversity to get me here, when the adversity wasn't really that bad, comparatively speaking. When you have that much of a safety net, it's not really adversity, shall we say. And yeah, just the utilization of a lower class status or something as like a diversity checkbox on an application, it's kind of gross. But yeah, I also found it interesting, as I kind of alluded to but didn't finish my thought about earlier. I find it interesting how the whole application process throughout season 3 is less about college applications in general and the process and the system and the fairness or unfairness of it, or the actual work that goes into that, as the interpersonal dynamics at play, in terms of Rory and Lorelai being like, it's me and you against the world. I don't want Emily and Richard involved in this. Doesn't matter what anybody else says. We're going to make this decision. We, not you, we are going to make this decision. And not only that, but like, if you kind of broaden out the scope, how, you know, Dean asks the question, what's going to happen when you move next year? And their dynamics of differences in academic attainment and class and opportunity. Because in this episode with the lunch, at the very end of it, she's like, well, why don't you just go to a junior college in Boston and get an apartment? As if Dean has all the money in the world to afford that, or that he has a support system that can just pay for that for him, that he would be able to work a job that would allow him to afford to live in a city like Boston. And her expecting him to follow her to Boston, it's just a whole thing. Just more classist BS coming up in that. So I find it really interesting how they use it as a framework to tell us more about Rory and Lorelai and their beliefs, and to have, you know, the pushback against Richard and Emily, as opposed to like, any true consideration of what the realities of this would be, or again, any real contention with whether Harvard is the right place for Rory.
Yeah. Well said. Do you think then, going along with that, like, I'll ask us this, because we've talked about everything that we hate within the admissions process. Is there anything about it to love? Is there anything that's still good about it that we can find?
I mean, it's always going to be kind of a difficult process to navigate, at least in your country. I feel like mine was really straightforward. I didn't have a lot of like hemming and hawing over anything. I just sort of picked stuff at random, and it was like an eeny, meeny, miny, mo process. I just wanted to live in Ottawa because I had friends there, and everything else was just like well, I need to apply somewhere. So I just kind of picked random places. Whereas, like, just, it also blows my mind that there are people who put stuff up on YouTube. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's really interesting to me, this phenomenon of people who are making content on YouTube about how they organize their university applications process, how many schools they applied to, reading out their college essays, and recording themselves having reactions to whether or not they're accepted places. And they will put compilations together and put it up on YouTube for consumption. And these are massively popular videos, like millions of views on these things. People love this stuff. There's something fun about it. And I think it's not so much the application process itself. I think that is difficult and convoluted and stressful to the high heavens. But I think the fun part is on the other side, when you've got those admissions in hand and you start to make decisions about the future. It really does feel like a massive accomplishment, and it is. It's great. There's so much hope for the future when you get that in hand. Like, I still remember, again, I got into U Ottawa early, and I got my UBC admissions a little bit later, just because that's how the timing was and how they came out. But I think it was like February or something that I got UBC. And because I had already made my decision, I let the letter sit on my desk. I didn't even open it. I was like, I know where I'm going. And then one day I walked by it, and it was the big one, and it said yes on it. And I opened it up and I flipped through the booklet, and I was like, oh my God, is that what winter looks like in Vancouver? And my mind was made up. I was like, I'm moving to BC, and I'm, minus 30 Ottawa, or like no snow winters in BC. What shall I do? Yeah, and it's funny how it like didn't really come down to the programs, because actually UBC didn't have the program I wanted to study initially, which is kind of good, because the exploration I was able to do at UBC led me on a different path. And, I had opportunities there that I wouldn't have had if I stuck to international development. So I find it really interesting. But yeah, it's that sort of like the excitement of getting the big one. I get it. I've been there. I got the big one twice. I got a bunch of yeses, but I wasn't really excited about any of the other ones. It was just those two that were sort of like big moments for me. So that's the good part. The rest of it is crap. Throw it out, put it in the bin. Let's start from scratch and like make the education system better. But that's kind of neither here nor there. But I feel like there's a few more things that I do want to touch on before we wrap up, because we are getting kind of like, we've been going for a long time. I want to talk a little bit about Pose and Fire. Rory's going to yell. Because this is finally where Lorelai has her come to Jesus moment a little bit with where Rory's going to school. And she finally puts aside all of her own crap with her parents, and they look at the pro-con list, they look at the data, and they determine that Yale is the place for Rory. How do we feel about that moment? What was your reaction to that?
I wish Lorelai had gotten on board a little bit sooner. Because at the end of the day, it's not about what's going to make you happy as a parent in terms of where your child is going to school and the career path that they're choosing to take. It's about what they want for themselves. And as long as it's something that is, appropriate, healthy, that is going to lead them to their own personal fulfillment and happiness, I think that needs to be at the forefront. So I do wish that Lorelai could have just put aside her own ish, for lack of a better way of putting it, like a lot sooner and gotten on board with being more supportive of your daughter. I'm glad that she has, her come to Jesus moment where she does eventually realize, like, this is what is going to make my daughter the most happy. And therefore, I will support her vehemently going forward. But it took her time to get there. And it was something that Rory recognized and took stock of, that, like, my mom is unhappy with the decision that I am trying to make for myself. And it knocked Rory down a couple of pegs, and it caused her undue stress and anxiety, because now she had to contend with, I'm trying to do what is best for me, but I am making my mother and my best friend feel like, or at least I feel like I have failed them because I'm not making the choice that they want. It's not about that. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's fair. I still think of that moment in Deep Fried Korean Thanksgiving where they're sitting at the table and Rory reveals that she had to apply to backups and she picked Yale and Princeton. And Lorelai just loses her absolute ish about, like, why Yale? Like, why did you do this? And she just goes from 0 to paranoia in 10 seconds or less. And, like, Richard and Emily rightfully point out that, like, this is, like, Rory is not a puppet. We didn't try to influence this anywhere beyond Yale. We saw your reaction. We didn't do anything else. But, we did expose her to Yale. If she likes it, it's her prerogative to apply there. She doesn't have to, but, she's already kind of made it this far in the process. She already had an interview. Why not? And Rory has to justify herself to her mom. And I'm like, why are you guys not talking about this better? Why are you hiding it from her that you're applying there? Even if it was contentious, you should still tell her. You guys talk about everything. What is this? And it just goes to Lorelai's, inability to process anything that her fingers or her parents' fingerprints are on, and how that impacts Rory and Rory's decisions, and having any sense of autonomy in choosing the path for her life, right? So I find it really interesting, and I'm glad that Lorelai eventually comes around and says, if it's right for you, then it's really right for me. And Rory has to be like, I don't want you to hate where I'm going. And that's sad. Like, the fact, like, Lorelai has been a very supportive parent, and the fact that Rory felt like she had to suppress her excitement for something other than Harvard is just really sad. So, yeah. I love that that Lorelai eventually got on board, but I don't like how we got there, because it was classic Lorelai. She made it about herself a lot. When they went to Yale, again, she flipped it and was like, oh, here we go. Your daughter's a loser. She didn't go to college. Gilmore name sullied. It reflects badly on you. So she made this moment that was about providing Rory with an opportunity for her future and providing her with other options or backups. It became about Lorelai's failures in Lorelai's mind, even though that's not what Richard was trying to do. He was just trying to help Rory out. His heart was in the right place. Again, shouldn't have sprung it on him like that, but good intentions. And even later, when Rory drops out of Yale, she goes to Luke and says, how could this have happened? She was supposed to have everything I never had. So you're turning your daughter's mental turmoil and her, like, feelings of a lack of direction in her life and her pain right now, her just not knowing, like, not feeling connected to this, not knowing what to do with herself. Again, you're making it about you. It's like, she's only at Yale because you didn't get to go to Harvard or Yale. Like, that's not what this is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about what's right for Rory. And again, a good thing for parents to keep in mind when their kids are making decisions like this about their life. You have to let them drive the conversation, because if they don't have the intrinsic drive to succeed, they're never going to get anywhere. Rory eventually found her passion again, and she got back to Yale just like they wanted her to. But it shouldn't have been about that. It shouldn't have been about being at Yale or being at Harvard or anything. It should be about where's the right place for her and what's right for her life. And when I was going through this process, when I was going through school entirely, like, my mom was just nothing but supportive. She's just like, you love school, you're good at school, we'll, like, we'll support you in whatever way we can. And like, there was absolutely no pressure to go anywhere in particular or do anything in particular. It all came from in here. And that's how I finished my degree. I overcame a lot of stuff at university in terms of my mental health and my will to succeed at times. And it had to come from in here, and it did. So that's my like parting wisdom, I guess, is that. But before I totally leave off on this track, I do want to point out the timeline discrepancy with this decision, because this is the timeline of the fire and all of that is actually quite well established. So they've been making their pro and con list. The fire happens. The chief says they can't get in for at least 24 hours. And so we know that this is all happening in like a 30 to 36 hour period. And so in the evening, when Rory is packing up to go to Lane's, her board is still covered in Harvard stuff. And this is when they have that conversation about, like, if you want it to be Yale, it can be Yale. And then Rory goes off for the evening. Then the next morning, the next thing we see is everybody having breakfast at Luke's, and the chief being like, okay, you can come back and get all your stuff now. And then Rory leaves either Lane's or Luke's to go back to the house to get ready for school, which has to be at like 7 a.m. And yet her board is now covered in all of the Yale stuff. Like, most university bookstores are really only open from like 10 a.m. to 6 to 8 p.m., depending on the day of the week and the time of the year. So when did you have time to go shopping for all of that Yale stuff? And like, especially because you live half an hour from New Haven, how, like, even if this was a 7 p.m. conversation and not a 9 p.m. conversation, it still would have taken you like 30 minutes to get to New Haven. But we know you didn't, because you were setting up the Larsons for sleep and then you went to Luke's. You didn't go to New Haven. Where did all that stuff come from? Did you buy it last time you were at Yale and just like tuck it away for this moment in case it happened? Like, what the hell?
Yeah, I was going to say like a magic fairy like airdropped it in, but
yeah, sure.
I mean, maybe she did. Maybe she did have it hiding somewhere, because she was slowly realizing that this was going to be Rory's path, and maybe it just took her some time to actually be okay with that, and her bringing out that, the pennants and all of the memorabilia and the goodies that she had purchased was Lorelai's own acceptance of it. But maybe she needed time to get there. I don't know. We're just theorizing, but you make an excellent point.
But if that's the case, like, that could feel like a waste of money if she doesn't eventually go to Yale. It's like the Super Bowl, when they make Super Bowl champ hats and shirts for both teams, even though only one can win, and then everything else gets donated to Africa. Just wasteful. Merca. Yeah, stuff like that. It's, it's more about the moment, but it makes no damn sense. Like, for a show that can sometimes have such beautiful parallels in a larger narrative sense, they really don't pay attention to a lot of the details. And this also happens when it comes to the financial aid stuff and the money. It's really just used as a plot device instead of like taking even 5 minutes to fact check themselves about how this stuff would work. Because, and we'll probably talk about this more when we talk about the economics of education, but the money that Lorelai got from her father for the investment for her birthday wouldn't have shown up on her taxes. Yale would not know about it yet, unless she was like, oh, here, as of like April 26th is my bank account balance. No, all the stuff would have been like put in much earlier. It would not have shown up, but I'm sure we'll get to that. There's a lot more stuff I could say too about college admissions and all that, but I think I'll try to roll it into that episode about like the finances of education and all that, because a lot of the points I have left are about sort of like how colleges are basically businesses and you're an investment, and how you are looking for a return on investment on education and all of those things. So I think that will fit nicely there, and we should start wrapping this one up. Any last thoughts before we go?
No, I mean, we've pretty much touched on everything. I would just say, for anyone who may be watching this or who is a young person, a middle-aged person that is returning back to school, that is trying to formulate their own career path and find out what it is they want to do in life. Don't let other people dictate what that's going to look like for you or what that's going to be. Just make it your own. And just make your own choices. Let your success be self-driven, not what you think society or what even family members or friends may want to see in you. Just make it about what is going to lead to your own personal happiness, and let that drive the admission process and your continuing education path for you. That's it.
Couldn't set up better myself.
Yep. But that is going to wrap us up here because we have been going on for quite some time. Again, we always have things that are left unsaid, but that's just us.
Yep.
What is coming up next for us, though, on the Gilmore Way?
Birthdays. I was like, how do I do this? Go TGW. It's your birthday, except it's not, because that's not till November. But yeah, we're going to be talking about all the birthdays on the show and how sort of these, temporal landmarks in time for us as human beings impact us and our relationships with those around us. Like, we have a couple episodes that are very prominently centered on birthdays and how people sort of interact with each other around that. Like, think about Rory's birthday parties and what that told us about the relationship between Lorelai and Emily and Rory and Lorelai and Rory and Stars Hollow and Rory. And, then we have Lorelai's 35th birthday that I just talked about with the check. So that's going to come up. We're going to talk about that money. We're going to talk about Rory's 21st. We're going to talk about Logan's 25th. And obviously the super cool party people episode where Lorelai decides to just insert herself into Luke's relationship with his daughter. So come back next week and join us for all of that. There will be party hats.
Yep, that is going to be a very good one. In the meantime, if you need more GG content, first and foremost, watch the show more, because you can never rewatch enough. So just go and circle back to your favorite episodes, but also go back and maybe watch some of our old TGW episodes if you want some more content. We just did some really good ones. Most specifically, and one I want to highlight the most, is the one that we did a few weeks back with Jenny from the FanFest Society. Update on that: if you are not able to go for that entire weekend in Maine, day passes are now a thing. So if you can only attend on Friday or Saturday or Sunday and you still want to dive deep into the GG universe, you can now do it. If you want more information on that, go back and watch that video, but we will also include a link in the description below to the website where you can get tickets and more info on that. And please consider doing it because it's just a wonderful time and you'll meet a lot of really great people. Yeah. Other than that, yep, go. Oh,
but definitely make sure you get a ticket for Sunday. Because your TGW gals will be running a game that day. We're going to be running Gilmore's Against Humanity. So stay tuned for updates on that. We're still working out the logistics and the gameplay for that, but I think it's going to be a riot.
Yeah, if you like memes and you like Cards Against Humanity, that is the panel for you. So yeah, come to the event on Sunday and we'll be hosting that afternoon. Again, we'll provide more updates with that as we work that out a little bit better. But just go to FanFest.
Yeah, we're very
excited. Have a good time. We promise.
Yeah, we can't wait to meet you all.
Yep. While you wait for that, again, just go back and watch some of our old videos. And please remember to always do those YouTube-y things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate all of the support. It makes us happy and it just, keeps us in coffee, pun intended. Yeah. That being said, thank you for checking out this episode and having dinner with us. And we'll see you next Friday for dinner.
Bye.
Ciao.